Well, good morning. We are glad to have you here. People were a little loud when Garth got up to lead singing, so I thought, well, I'll close the kitchen doors because they were still doing a few things in there. And between Jerry and I think somebody got hit by those swinging doors about 10 times, which I guess it just teaches me a lesson. Should never shut the doors. Leave them open. Let people come in. We are glad you are here. If you're visiting with us, we're glad to have you. Today, we're having a potluck. And no matter where you came from or what you brought with you, stick around. There's plenty of food. Plus, Curtis said he'd make some fish and bread, or at least me and Ed show up or something like that. So we're good. We're discussing Nehemiah. If you want to turn there, we're going to be in chapter 2 today. Nehemiah chapter 2. Just a quick recap. This will be our fourth lesson. And real briefly, we really talked about just three things. First week, we talked about the idea that Nehemiah, when his brothers came from Jerusalem, he questioned them. The whole theme of these lessons is rebuilding walls, putting up defenses, making sure that people are safe and protected, and that their relationships with God, with each other, and with their spouses and their children are relationships that can be behind walls where they can feel safe. We talked about finding projects and finding things to rebuild in our Christian lives. And one of the ways that we do that is by asking questions, by listening, by paying attention to what people are saying. The second week, we talked about how Nehemiah embraced what he had heard. He'd heard that Jerusalem's walls were still in disrepair, still broken down, still burned. And he took that to heart. And he spends a lot of time telling us just how mournful he was, how sad he was, how he prayed and wept and he fasted. And he internalized that emotion. He didn't let him control him. He didn't let it control him. He remembered the promises of God. And he took that emotion, he took that sadfulness, and he took it to God and said, God, this is how I feel. I know that you promised someday that you would rebuild things, that your people would return to Jerusalem. But the point there, live with that emotion. Don't let it control you, but let it motivate you. Let it be the thing that gets us to week 3. And then last week in week 3, we talked about how Nehemiah took that first scary step. No matter what you want to do, no matter what you feel called to do, there comes a point where you need to take that step. You need to get out there. After the fact finding, after the feelings and emotions, and after the prayer and fasting, Nehemiah acted on it. And as I was getting ready for this week, something that I didn't bring up last week that maybe I should have, Nehemiah spent a lot of time in prayer, and prayer's important. Prayer's great. What I'm about to say, I don't want to be misconstrued as prayer cannot be a destination. But I think sometimes we get stuck in the prayer level. We hear about things that are happening. We hear about things that we could be doing, and we pray about it. And sometimes I think prayer can become like, me. I like going through my productivity systems without always being productive. I keep rearranging the to-do list. I keep organizing it. I keep reading material on it. I keep telling myself this is what you're going to do. But at some point, you got to do. Just got to go. Nehemiah did. He took that first step. And don't, I hate to throw prayer. I'm not trying to throw shade at prayer, because prayer can also be the thing you need to do. It can also be the destination. It can also be the end point. I'm sure that my wife doesn't want me to just talk to her so that we can figure out the rest of the week and do. Sometimes the communication is the point, but sometimes we get stuck in the communication. Take that step. Which brings us to this week, and we're in chapter 2, verse 11 of Nehemiah. I like the fact that Nehemiah spent a chapter and a half telling us all about everything that took place there at Susa, took place there with the king, and then he just magically shows up in Jerusalem. The journey's not mentioned hardly at all. Boom, he skips forward. So here we are in chapter 2, verse 11. So I arrived in Jerusalem 3 days later. I put the punctuation in the wrong place. Let me reread that. So I arrived in Jerusalem. 3 days later, didn't take him 3 days to get to Jerusalem, but 3 days after he was there, I slipped out during the night, taking only a few others with me. I had not told anyone about the plans God had put in my heart for Jerusalem. We took no pack animals with us except the donkey I was riding. After dark, I went out through the valley gate, past the jackal's well, and over to the dung gate to inspect the broken walls and burned gates. Then I went to the fountain gate and to the king's pool, but my donkey couldn't get through the rubble. So, though it was still dark, I went up to the Kidron Valley instead, inspecting the wall before I turned back and entered again at the valley gate. The city officials did not know I had been out there or what I was doing, for I had not yet said anything to anyone about my plans. I had not yet spoken to the Jewish leaders, the priests, the nobles, the officials, or anyone else in the administration. But now I said to them, "You know very well what trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire. Let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem and end this disgrace." Then I told them about how the gracious hand of God had been on me and about my conversation with the king. Few things to notice in those verses. Number one, I like the fact that Nehemiah doesn't just ride in Jerusalem and start telling people why he's there and what they're going to do. Remember, Nehemiah is the newest guy in town. Some of these people have been in Jerusalem for decades. Some of them probably were there even after Jerusalem was ransacked. Not everybody was carried away. Some people had been brought there by the Babylonians to re-inhabit the area. So there's a lot of people living in Jerusalem, and they've been living, probably in their estimation, just fine. You know, I forget where I heard this, but there's an old movie, there's an old prospector out in the desert. Been prospecting out in that desert for 20 years. And everybody asks, why doesn't he give it up? Well, because then that's admitting to himself he's wasted 20 years. There's people in Jerusalem that if Nehemiah just comes in and says, "Hey, everybody, it's time to rebuild the walls," how would you feel? Better yet, let me ask you this. How would you feel if, I'll pick on Garth, since he's the newest guy in the building, if Garth got up here this morning and told us how we need to start singing differently? I've been here for a month already, and your guys' singing is atrocious. And we're going to rearrange it. I want all the altos over here. And boy, he just lays it. You know, how does that make you feel? He might be absolutely correct. But how's it going to make you feel? I don't like people coming into my house telling me how to cook. I certainly don't like people coming to my house and telling me how to make coffee. For those of you who know me. And I'm sure the Jerusalemites, I don't know if that's, those people living in Jerusalem probably wouldn't have taken too well to that being the first things that he said. But he needs to say it sooner or later. Nehemiah has the materials, he has the authority, he has everything he needs to rebuild Jerusalem's walls, except the people of Jerusalem. So what does he do? Well, first of all, he waits 3 days. But then he goes out at night. Nobody's really going to see what he's doing. And we're told that he takes some others. I don't know what others he took. I get the impression they weren't the priests or the city administrators or the nobles. But he takes some other people out there. And he takes them on a tour. Takes them on a tour to check out the walls. And as they're out there touring, you get this impression just from the language he uses. I like the fact that he describes it so thoroughly. And not from Jerusalem, I have no idea where any of these places are. Didn't look at a map because I would just forget it. But he takes them gate to gate, place to place. He even describes, hey, we even had to go a different route because we couldn't get through there. The rubble was too thick. And so basically, he goes out on this tour, reinforces what he already felt, that this is a disgrace, but he takes some people with him. Nehemiah had a vision. Nehemiah had a dream, he had a goal, he had a project, and he did everything he needed to get that project going. He got time off from the king. He got all the materials he wanted. He had letters of authority so that nobody could stop him or interrupt him. He had everything he needed. And here he is at the place that he needs to build the walls. And he's got everything he could possibly hope for to build the walls, except the wall builders. His next step is he's got to get some construction workers. You know, we always talk about Nehemiah rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem. Nehemiah didn't rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. A whole bunch of Jerusalemites rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem. You know, if you're looking in a picture Bible, it probably doesn't have a picture of Nehemiah out there moving stuff. I mean, Nehemiah's, you know, he's organizing, he's doing it. But at some point, Nehemiah needs actual people to put this wall back together. And so he's smart about it. He goes out with a few others. I don't know who those few others were, but my guess they were people that he specifically wanted to see just how bad things are. And he takes them out there, and then he comes back and he tells the people, hey, this is what we're going to do. But there's a few others in the crowd who are saying, yeah, have you seen the walls? Has anybody gone out there? You almost get the impression from reading it that the people in Jerusalem they moved in Jerusalem and never went outside, never checked it out. They didn't feel too bad about it. And it's easy to scoff at that. But how many of us know the conditions of our neighborhoods? How many of us go around town looking to see what things look like? How many of us talk to our neighbors? I took the trash out the other night. My neighbor has no back fence. I didn't know that. I didn't know how long, because, you know, maybe Keith knew that. Keith sometimes takes the trash out for him. And shame on me, I didn't go over there and say, hey, when you're rebuilding this thing, I'd like to help. Let's get back inside before he sees me out here with nothing to do. Nehemiah takes them for a tour. And again, I don't know who those few people are. But my guess is they were people who were influential. Maybe they were even people who were a little skeptic about what he might be doing. But when he finally goes before the people and says, this is what we're going to do, what do the people say? Go back and look at that. But now I said to them, you know very well what trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire. Let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem and end this disgrace. Then I told them about how the gracious hand of God had been on me and about my conversation with the king. I like the way it says there, but now I said to them, you know very well what trouble we are in. My guess is a few days before that, they didn't know what trouble they were in, or they would have done something. Part of Nehemiah transferring his vision to the people of Jerusalem is going out, not just himself, but going out with some others to see just how bad things are. Nehemiah showed them what the world was like out there. When I originally was writing and typing, I entitled this lesson, The Heart Sees What the Heart Sees. It's one of my favorite phrases in life. The heart wants what the heart wants. Just yesterday, we had a musical discussion in our house. Mary and myself are very much big fans of music with no words, background music, study music. And we were discussing wonderful hits from video games. It's a depth of good music in video games. And Wendy scoffed at us. Wendy, number one, sees no purpose in music without words. She's not here today. She's probably watching online. So she scoffed at us. Just by the way, anybody ever heard of the album Upstairs at Eric's by Yaz? Yeah, probably only the people who know Wendy, because I mean it's not music. I don't know what it is. It's we sang Joyful, Joyful, We Adore Thee this morning. One of my favorite songs in the book. I don't know if it's musical or not, but it's the first song I learned to play on the piano. I had to take piano lessons, and like any good piano student, that's one of the first ones you learn. I didn't even know it had words till I grew up. And my guess is that song is very special to Wendy because she was probably, in 7th grade. It was on the radio that the bus driver was driving. But the heart wants what the heart wants. I've been trying to sell you guys on Yo-Yo Ma for years, and Richard still laughs at me. Nehemiah needs to get the people of Jerusalem to see what he sees. The heart sees what the heart sees. And he needs those people to see something that makes them feel uncomfortable, that makes them feel like it's a disgrace. And so he takes a few others out with him. And maybe when he came back, those few others started talking to people. Have you seen? I mean, we couldn't even get through that one trail back there. The rubble was too much. And understand something. It's easy for us to get comfortable, regardless of how much rubble is around us. It's easy to get comfortable in our limited spaces. I'm sure the people of Jerusalem said, well, nobody's attacked us lately. What do we need a wall for? The king of Persia is keeping the peace. Matter of fact, don't we hear that later on? Don't the naysayers come and say, hey, what do you want to build a wall for? Isn't that just a sign to the king that you're about to rebel? We think that our families are safe because the only families we see are safe, or at least they look safe. We think that life is just fine because the only life we know seems just fine. Sometimes we need to leave our homes and our houses and take a stroll around the city walls. Nehemiah takes a tour to remind himself and a few others of just how dire their situation. I like the way they replied. When he finally tells them the plan, listen to what they say. They replied at once, yes, let's rebuild the wall. So they begin the good work. That phrase, the good work, is something you'll see in Nehemiah a little bit later as well. But that's what they see now. It's amazing. They didn't see it before. Many of those people had lived there for decades and hadn't seen it before. But now they see it. They see this good work. It's not just rebuilding the walls. It's not just what Nehemiah wants. Now it's the good work. It's a different view. But it's not the only view. Let's read the next two verses, starting in verse 19. Verses 19 and 20 say this. But when Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem the Arab heard of our plan, they scoffed contemptuously. What are you doing? Are you rebelling against the king? They asked. And I replied, the God of heaven will help us succeed. We, his servants, will start rebuilding this wall, but you have no share, legal right, or historic claim in Jerusalem. You know, there's always going to be those with a different point of view, isn't there? These three men were regional authorities. I think I read that they were probably to the other side of the Jordan, to the south and to the north a little bit, but it doesn't really matter what they ruled. They were local authorities. They were regional authorities in the area. They probably had every right to kind of be checking things out, seeing what's happening down there in Jerusalem. They had some sway, it appears, over what was happening in Judah. We even get the impression a little bit later that they were probably trying to talk some of the nobles into not join Nehemiah's plan. And maybe they were just upset because a strong Jerusalem meant that their own power would dwindle. Their points may have even had some validity to them. I think that's one of the things that I have a hard time understanding. Sometimes the scoffers do make valid points, but it's a different perspective. Listen to what Nehemiah said to him again. The God of heaven will help us succeed. We, his servants, will start rebuilding this wall. You have no share, legal right, or historic claim in Jerusalem. And I think there's 3 points in what Nehemiah says that are pretty good. Number one, he says, our king isn't your king. Who your king is makes a big difference on what's important. Our king isn't your king. He also says, this is our project, not your project. And then lastly, he says, you have no business in our business. I like those 3 ideas. There are always going to be other visions. There's always going to be people who see things from a different perspective, from another point of view. But our God isn't their God. We should see things from a different perspective. Starting with, what's a success? That's something I struggle with all the time. Winnie and I had 3 children. And from the moment you have children, you start thinking about what is successful child rearing. Well, that's a tricky question. I heard somebody once ask me, I didn't hear him ask, I heard him ask a whole group, but I was in the group, so felt like it cut right to my heart. What do you want from your children? Do you want them to be happy? Do you want them to be successful? Do you want them to serve God? And I know the answer they wanted. Serve God. Amen. There's a little part of me that says, well, I'd really like them to be successful and happy. Can't they be all 3? Our God isn't their God. What is successful if you're raising a godly child? What's happy? Matter of fact, who's got any guarantees on happy? It's the difference between happy and joyful. Our failures aren't their failures. In God, sometimes our failures are starting places. In God, sometimes our failures are God transforming us into something else. So I like that. Our King isn't your king. Our God isn't your God. Or in the words of Jeremiah, the God of heaven will help us succeed. The second thing he said, don't accept criticism from people who are not involved in your project. You could be a non-believer and that's still good advice. I don't care what you think of the Cincinnati Reds. You're not a Reds fan. I don't care what you think of my family. You're not responsible for them. God is, and God might be using you to influence me. I'm not trying to cut that out. But don't accept criticism from people who are not invested in your project. Don't take marriage advice from people who don't value marriage. Don't listen. I said it wrong. Listen to fellow wall builders, not neighbors with no walls. And lastly, the last point from that phrase from Jeremiah, the only person who has a share, legal right, or a historic claim to your life is God. I love Matt to death. I appreciate the fact that he's always there. I can always, if a sermon's going bad, I can look up and Matt's giving me a head nod. Okay. Don't move. And God might use Matt to influence my life. But there is nobody who has a share, legal right, or historic claim to my life other than God. And we need to quit allowing people to think they have it. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying don't share your life with others. I'm not saying don't be a part of other people's lives. But when it comes to decision making, God is the one who gave you life. God is the one who owns your life. God is the one who's been a part of your life. I often talk about worship being between you and God. I don't know, maybe it's just me. I like the idea that there's only really one person in this world I need to please. Now, don't get me wrong. I think pleasing some other people also pleases God. But there's only one person that at the end of the day, I answer to, and that's God. And when it comes to worship, I've always been a big defender. Don't let other people tell you how to worship God. But I think that can be stretched a little further. Don't let other people tell you what godly projects to take on. Don't let other people tell you what godly walls to rebuild. Don't let those who are not invested in the wall that you think's important, because God has laid that on your heart, because you have prayed about it, you've fasted over it, you've mourned about it. It is something that's important to you and God. Don't let others tell you why it's not. Last thing in my notes. If the wall's important to you and God, it's an important wall. and get to rebuilding. Next week, we'll look at chapter 3, which I love chapter 3 because all it is about who's building what. But we're going to find some lessons in chapter 3. I look forward to that. If you're here this morning, I don't know what God's doing in your life. Maybe there's some walls that are torn down. Maybe there's some walls that are torn down by your own actions. Maybe even God's done it. Let's not forget, Jerusalem's walls were in ruins because of God. He's the one that sent the Babylonians. He's the one who tried to wake up the people of Israel. And maybe there's some things happening in your life that God is using to get you to come to him, to respond to him. If you're here this morning and that's the case, if you'll come forward, we'll be glad to help with that as we stand and sing the song of God. That's